The town sat in the shadow of a dense forest. The roads were narrow and twisted, surrounded by trees that blocked most of the sunlight. Even during the day, the town felt dark. The power grid was unreliable, so people relied on lanterns and generators. Life here was quiet, but there was always a feeling of unease that lingered in the air. It began with a farmer. He stumbled into the diner one evening. His boots were caked with mud, and his face was drained of color. The bell above the door jingled, but no one paid any notice at first. The farmer didn't say anything, just dropped a photograph on the counter. The picture showed a pile of bones. They were clean, almost shining, and arranged in a strange way. Around them, the ground looked wet with something dark and oily.
"Found it behind my barn,"
he said, his voice low, almost trembling.
"Coyotes?"
someone offered, though their tone was uncertain. The farmer shook his head. He explained that coyotes don't leave bones like this. And then the farmer shared a chilling detail. There was not a single trace of fur or tracks left behind. The room fell quiet as the photograph was passed from hand to hand. People exchanged nervous glances. Some muttered about predators, but others spoke in whispers about the old stories, the ones about the forest and the things that lived deep inside it. Behind the counter, the teenager on shift listened closely. He'd heard the stories before, but the picture made his skin crawl. When his shift ended, he stepped out into the cool night air, unable to shift the image of bones from his mind. His friends were already hanging out at the bowling alley. Greasy trays of nachos and fries were piled on the table. The rhythmic crashing of pins and the thud of classic rock music filled the air. He slid into the booth, grabbing a fry from one of the plates. He told them about the picture the farmer brought into the diner. His friends exchanged glances. "We should check it out," one of them said, grinning nervously. The teenager hesitated. "It's probably nothing." But the group had already decided. They reached the barn under a full moon. The air was cold, and the building loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the night sky. Its wooden frame creaked faintly in the breeze, the old boards warped and sagging. It looked like the structure could collapse at any moment. They climbed over the fence, the flashlight cutting through the dark. The pile of bones was there, just like the farmer had said. The flashlight beam caught the oily residue glinting on the ground around it. The smell hit them next, sharp and metallic, like rusted metal mixed with something sour. They stood there for a moment, taking in the strange sight. Then, the flashlight flickered.
"Don't do that,"
someone whispered at the boy holding the flashlight. But the teen didn't do anything. This wasn't the time or place for pranks. He looked down at the flashlight flickering in his hand. "I think it's running out of..." Before he could finish the sentence, the beam sputtered once, twice, and then went out, plunging them into pitch black. "Who's got another light?" someone else whispered, their voice shaky. No one did. The group huddled together, the silence pressing down on them. Then they heard it, a faint, wet sound, like something sliding across wood. It came from inside the barn.
"Did you hear that?"
someone whispered, their voice barely audible. One of the teens tried to feel their way towards the barn door, but it was too late. Something cold brushed against their ankle, and they yelped. The sound triggered movement, fast and chaotic. The wet sliding grew louder, and a dark shape spilled out from the corner of the barn, moving in unnatural liquid motions. A scream tore through the night as one of the teenagers was pulled away. The others fumbled blindly, their hands finding nothing but air as the shadow consumed their friend. The sound of bones cracking filled the air, followed by wet, gurgling cries that cut off suddenly. Another teenager was yanked backward, their feet scraping against the dirt as they screamed for help. The group scattered in panic, but the shadow moved faster. It wrapped around another, pulling them to the ground. The last thing the others heard was the sound of something tearing, followed by silence. The teenager who had suggested the trip stumbled and fell, his palms scraping against the dirt. He looked up just in time to see a tendril of shadow lunge toward him. It caught his leg. He let out a blood-curdling scream as it began to pull him back. In the chaos, a boy who had stayed near the back managed to wrench open the barn door. Moonlight spilled into the space, and for a moment, the shadow recoiled, hissing like steam hitting cold water. The boy's eyes widened. He took a step backward and then ran. The boy didn't stop. His feet pounded against the dirt path, and his breath tore from his lungs in ragged gasps. The forest blurred around him, but he didn't dare look back. He didn't want to see if the shadow was following. All he knew was that he had to get to town. He had to tell someone. When he burst into the main square, disheveled and wide-eyed, his screams drew a small crowd. He tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other.
It got him! In the barn! The shadow! It wasn't...
His hands trembled, and his face was pale with terror. The people listened, skeptical at first, but the boy's panic was infectious. Someone ran to fetch the sheriff, while others murmured among themselves, their unease growing. By the time the boy finished his frantic story, the once quiet town had erupted in a mix of fear and confusion. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Some dismissed the boy's tale as hysteria. Others whispered that it sounded too much like the old stories their grandparents used to tell, stories of things that moved in the dark. Either way, a creeping tension enveloped the town. Night fell, and the power grid failed with clockwork precision. Darkness swallowed the town whole, plunging every home into silence and shadow. Families huddled together around flickering candles, their whispers barely audible over the crackle of flames. Fear soaked into every corner, every conversation. No one wanted to admit it, but they knew something was wrong. Then, the disappearances began. It started small, a neighbor missing from their usual spot at the diner, a dog leash lying limp on an empty street, but soon, entire homes were found deserted. No signs of struggle, no broken doors or windows, just faint, chalky stains on furniture, bed sheets, and even clothing. Calcium deposits that made no sense. The sheriff's office had no answers. The unease turned to dread. The town's sheriff wasn't one for superstition. He dealt in facts, in evidence, but the stories piling up were testing even his pragmatism. What gnawed at him most was the thought of his mother, living alone at the edge of the forest. She insisted she was fine, brushing off his concerns with a wave of her hand. Still, he couldn't shake the image of her in the dark, defenseless against whatever was out there. One evening, he arrived at her house with a small camera tucked under his arm. She fussed at him, but he waved her off.
It's just in case,
he said, his voice steady but strained. He positioned the camera on her dresser, angling it to cover the bed and most of the room.
See?
He said, gesturing to the blinking red light.
Nothing to worry about.
She gave him a skeptical look, but nodded. As he left, she stood in the doorway, watching him with a mix of amusement and something deeper, concern maybe, or understanding. The blackout came as expected. The chief sat at his desk in the station, the camera feed pulled up on his laptop. The dim glow of the screen was the only light in the room. His mother lay in bed, the soft rise and fall of her chest reassuring him. He let out a breath, tension easing slightly. But then, the room on the screen shifted. It was subtle at first, the shadows near the dresser deepening, pooling like spilled ink. The chief leaned closer to the screen, his pulse quickening. The shadows moved. They crept along the floor, climbing the walls in slow, deliberate waves. The camera's night vision flickered, distorting the image. When it stabilized, something new had appeared. A dark, amorphous mass, barely discernible against the backdrop of the room. It shifted, flowing silently, almost like liquid smoke. It slid toward the bed. The chief's stomach turned to ice.
Mom,
he whispered to the screen, as if she could hear him. She stirred slightly, her face peaceful. The shadow stretched, tendrils reaching out like fingers. One brushed the edge of the bed, then another. The camera's feed glitched again, and when it returned, the shadow was gone. And so was his mother. He bolted from the station, his mind racing. When he burst into her house, the bed was empty. Her favorite quilt lay folded neatly at the foot, her glasses on the nightstand. The room smelled faintly, and on the pillow, a fine white dust caught the moonlight. "Mom!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. The silence that followed was deafening. The sheriff stood alone in his mother's room. His eyes darted from the empty bed to the faint dust coating the pillow. He reached out, running his fingers through the powder. It felt brittle, like crushed chalk, and crumbled away at his touch.
"Where are you?"
he whispered, his voice breaking. The silence answered with its cold indifference. He forced himself to move, stepping out into the hallway, Each creak of the floorboards echoed, amplifying the hollow feeling in his chest. He checked every room, every closet, calling her name. Nothing. Not a trace of her. Outside, the blackout draped the neighborhood in darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn. His breath misted in the cold night air as he scanned the property, hoping for some sign, any clue. That's when he saw it. A trail. Barely visible, a faint scattering of the same white dust shimmered under the moonlight, leading away from the house. It twisted through the yard, past the fence, and into the forest beyond. The sheriff hesitated, his grip tightening on the flashlight clipped to his belt. Every instinct screamed to wait until morning, to gather help, to think. But there wasn't time. His mother was out there. He unholstered his sidearm, checked the chamber, and stepped into the woods. The forest swallowed him whole. The air grew colder, the silence heavier with every step. The trail snaked between the trees, almost glowing in the unnatural dark. His flashlight beam bobbed with his movement, illuminating the gnarled roots and dense undergrowth that threatened to trip him. "Mom!" he called again. Ahead, something shifted. The sheriff stopped, holding his breath. The beam of his flashlight swept through the trees, catching fleeting movements at the edges of his vision. He turned sharply, the beam bouncing. Shadows flitted just out of reach, slipping between the trees like liquid. "Who's there?" he demanded, raising his weapon. His voice trembled despite his best efforts to keep it steady. The shadows didn't answer. Instead, the air changed. It thickened, heavy with a metallic tang that clung to his tongue and throat. The flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering, before plunging him into near-total darkness. He smacked the side of it, his pulse hammering, and the light returned, just in time to catch something move. It wasn't human. A mass of darkness slithered across the forest floor, pooling and stretching like oil on water. Tendrils unfurled, reaching out to the trees, the ground, and the air itself. The shadows seemed to feed on the light, pulling it in, and leaving only emptiness behind. The sheriff stumbled back, his boots catching on roots. He raised his gun, firing into the mass. The shots echoed, but the shadow didn't slow. It surged forward, the tendrils growing faster, more frantic. He turned and ran. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he sprinted through the trees. The path was uneven, but he didn't stop. He could feel the darkness behind him closing in. Its movements were almost silent, punctuated only by a faint, wet sound. The house came into view. He burst through the back door, slamming it shut and locking it. His chest heaved as he backed into the kitchen, his eyes fixed on the door. For a moment, the world narrowed to the ragged rhythm of his breath. Then, the lights flickered. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and floor. The shadows under the door thickened, dark tendrils seeping through the cracks like smoke. The sheriff backed away, his grip tightening on his weapon. His mother's face flashed in his mind, her soft smile, her reassuring laugh. He swallowed hard, raising the gun. The shadow surged. The sheriff braced himself, his gun aimed at the door, as the tendrils of darkness crept further into the room. The hum grew louder, a low, throbbing vibration that rattled the dishes on the counter and sent a shiver deep into his bones. He took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The kitchen lights flickered. The shadows pooled and swirled, stretching and retracting like something alive. It wasn't just darkness. It was hunger, sentient and deliberate. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The shadows receded, slipping under the door and retreating into the night. The hum faded, leaving only the sheriff's panicked breathing and the faint buzz of the overhead light. He didn't lower his gun. He couldn't. When dawn finally broke, the town was a different place. The fear that had simmered beneath the surface had boiled over. Whispers spread like wildfire, stories of vanished loved ones, strange shadows, and white dust left behind. The sheriff shared what he'd seen, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the weight of the encounter. His mother was gone, and no one doubted him anymore. By the following night, the town was in full survival mode. Every home was fortified. Lanterns were hung in windows, candles burned on mantels, and floodlights powered by generators illuminated yards and alleys. People carried flashlights and torches wherever they went. The streets, once quiet and dark, now glowed faintly with a patchwork of light. The townspeople organized patrols, teams of neighbors armed with whatever they could find to fight the darkness. They moved in groups, their flashlights sweeping through the shadows as they walked the streets. For a time, the efforts seemed to work. The disappearances slowed, and the oppressive hum in the air lessened, but the relief was short-lived. The blackouts continued. The darkness adapted. It moved differently now, slipping through cracks in doors and exploiting the shadows cast by the very lights meant to repel it. A family barricaded themselves in their living room, the glow of a dozen candles casting long shadows on the walls. When the candles burned out, they saw it, a mass of black seeping out from the corner, tendrils snaking toward them. By the time neighbors arrived, all that was left was a faint calcium residue on the furniture. The patrols grew more desperate. The sheriff joined every night, his flashlight never leaving his hand. People shared sightings of the shadow, recounting how it moved with terrifying precision. No one was safe, not even the animals. The town's only dog kennel was found empty one morning, every cage open, and a fine white powder dusting the floors. The escalating reports of disappearances and skeletal remains caught the attention of the SCP Foundation. Emergency broadcasts, local news segments, and frantic calls for help painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. A mobile task force, posing as government safety inspectors, arrived in the town. Their vehicles were unmarked, their presence quiet but purposeful. The residents, too desperate to question, welcomed the strangers. Portable floodlight arrays were set up around the town, replacing the unreliable local power grid. As they worked, the Foundation assigned the anomaly its official designation, SCP-575.
Hold the grid steady, the team leader ordered, his voice sharp through the comms. We can't afford a gap.
The floodlights roared to life, their intense beams creating a stark boundary. The darkness recoiled, pooling at the edges like ink spreading in water. For a moment, it seemed to work. The team watched as SCP-575 stilled, its tendrils retreating from the searing light.
We've got it,
one of the agents muttered, their voice tinged with cautious hope. But the victory was short-lived. The darkness began to ripple, shuddering like a living thing under the pressure of the light. Then, it fractured. The entity splintered into smaller, independent forms, each one slipping through cracks in walls and beneath door frames. The fragments regrouped in other parts of the town, spreading faster than the team could react.
Fall back, the lead shouted. We're losing containment.
The agents scrambled, repositioning the floodlights in a desperate attempt to cut off the shadows. But SCP-575 moved with unnerving precision, its fragments darting into places the light couldn't reach. One by one, the zones they had fortified all fell into darkness. The team convened in the mobile command center, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Maps of the town were spread across the table, marked with red circles showing the areas SCP-575 had overtaken. It was adapting. They needed a new approach. The lead agent leaned forward, their fingers tracing the pattern of red marks on the map.
This isn't random, they said, their voice low. It's moving with purpose, circling back to certain areas. It's almost like it's protecting something.
A researcher flipped through the dossier of a local folklore, his brow furrowed.
There's a lot of talk about a heart of darkness in the old stories here, he said.
He went on to explain that some stories described a shadow that lived in the forest that preyed on anything foolish enough to enter after sundown. It sounded like superstition, but the descriptions were eerily close to what they had seen. The other agents scoffed.
Do any of you have a better idea?
The lead agent snapped.
We've tried everything else.
The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. The researcher continued hesitantly.
If the folklore holds any truth, this thing might have a central point, a place it originates from, a home base, if you will. If we can find it, we might stand a chance of containing it.
The team exchanged glances, the weight of the decision hanging heavily. Finally, the lead agent nodded.
Fine. We follow the pattern. Cross-reference every blackout, every disappearance, and pinpoint where this thing might be hiding. If it has a lair, we'll find it.
One of the agents tapped a pencil against the map. It was the forest. Most of the blackout zones converged near the old logging trail. It was the most isolated point on the map.
Perfect for us to walk into a trap, an agent muttered under their breath. The lead agent's gaze hardened. It'll keep picking us off. We need to take the fight to it.
Preparations began immediately. The team equipped themselves with portable floodlights, thermal imaging cameras, and motion sensors. Generators hummed to life, powering lights that would push back even the deepest shadows. Their movements were sharp and deliberate, but beneath the surface, a current of unease followed. Before they left, the lead agent addressed the group.
Stick together. No heroics. If we find its base, we don't engage unless we're sure we can contain it. Clear?
A chorus of affirmations followed, but their faces betrayed their doubt. As they stepped out into the night, the forest loomed ahead, its towering trees casting long, jagged shadows. The hunt was on. The forest swallowed them whole. The agents moved in tight formation, their floodlights slicing through the darkness. Every step was deliberate, every rustle of leaves underfoot sending ripples of tension through the group. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the sharp tang of pine mingling with something heavier, an acrid, metallic scent that stuck to their throats.
Eyes sharp,
the lead agent said, their voice barely audible over the hum of the portable generator strapped to their back. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The first sign appeared just beyond an old clearing. One agent paused, shining their light over a tree trunk. Deep gouges scored the bark, long and jagged, as if something massive had raked its claws through the wood.
Fresh,
the agent whispered, their breath fogging in the cold air.
It's close.
The team pressed on, the trail narrowing as the trees closed in. Their floodlights began to sputter, the beams dimming for fractions of a second before stabilizing. The air thickened, each breath a struggle as the metallic tang grew stronger.
There!
Someone hissed, pointing ahead. At the heart of the forest, they found it. A massive sinkhole gaped in the earth, jagged rocks framing its edges like teeth. The darkness within was absolute, swallowing the beams of their lights as though the void itself were alive. Tendrils of shadow writhed at the edge of the pit, pulling at the light, testing its boundaries. One agent raised a thermal scanner, their hands trembling.
No heat signatures, they muttered. It's nothing. Just a void.
The lead agent wasn't buying it.
Get the floodlights into position, he commanded.
The team moved quickly, setting up the portable lights around the perimeter of the sinkhole. Each floodlight roared to life, piercing the gloom with searing white beams. The shadows recoiled, hissing as they withdrew deeper into the pit.
Keep them steady, the lead agent barked. Don't let the beams break.
The tendrils lashed out, faster than the eye could follow. One struck a light, knocking it off balance. An agent dove forward, catching the unit before it hit the ground. The shadow hissed again, retreating as the light's beam steadied.
It's fighting back,
someone muttered, their voice tight with fear. The lead agent pulled out a device, a prototype containment unit designed for anomalies like this. It hummed to life, emitting a low-frequency pulse that vibrated through the ground.
Deploy the array, they ordered.
The device unleashed a web of light, a lattice of beams that expanded over the sinkhole like a net. The shadows writhed violently, their tendrils snapping at the edges of the light. The hum grew louder, the air vibrating with energy.
It's working,
an agent shouted, their voice filled with hope. The shadows began to contract, pulling inward as the light closed around them. The pit seemed to shudder, the tendrils thrashing wildly in a final, desperate attempt to escape. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the shadows were gone. The sinkhole went still, the light holding steady over its surface.
Status,
the lead agent asked, their voice calm but edged with tension. One agent scanned the area with a handheld device.
No movement, no anomalies detected. It's contained.
The team exhaled as one, relief washing over them like a wave. The lead agent didn't relax. He stared at the sinkhole, his jaw tight.
Pack it up,
he said finally, but he knew it wasn't over. As the team dismantled the containment array, the forest seemed to exhale, the silence breaking with the faint rustle of leaves. But even as they prepared to leave, a single thought hung heavy in the air. They had contained it. For now. But SCP-575 wasn't gone. Parts of it were waiting, biding their time, and everyone knew it. SCP-575 has proven itself to be both cunning and annoyingly persistent. SCP-575 is highly vulnerable to intense illumination. Containment focuses on maintaining constant lighting within its designated containment area. High-intensity floodlights and backup power generators are used to ensure no dark spaces remain. Its containment chamber is equipped with overlapping floodlight arrays, minimizing the potential for shadows. Automated systems activate auxiliary lighting in the event of a power failure. The entity's behavior is constantly observed via cameras and sensors, ensuring that any breaches are detected immediately. SCP-575 can split into smaller autonomous forms that regroup in complete darkness. While light disrupts and immobilizes it, the entity has proven capable of targeting generators and light sources to regain strength. SCP-575 has also been observed to mimic sounds and human voices to lure victims into its reach, demonstrating its strategic nature. SCP-575 has been classified as KETER due to its predatory behavior, adaptability, and the significant threat it poses in the absence of light. Containment remains a priority, with research ongoing to better understand its origins and capabilities.